Hey everybody, welcome back to Math Pastor. In this episode, we're going to talk about the least common multiple. Throughout this series of videos, we've been talking about factors, fractions, and exponents. Specifically, we talked about finding the prime factorization of a number, what a factor is, finding the greatest common factor, and then looking at equivalent fractions and simplifying fractions. Today, we're going to look at the least common multiple and how that moves into understanding fractions on a whole new level when we talk about the least common denominator. All right, so there are four terms we need to know as we explore this idea of least common multiple. The first is multiple. The second is common multiple. The third is least common multiple. As you can see, these three build upon one another. And the final one is least common denominator, and that's going to deal with fractions and comparing fractions. And that's going to move us into adding and subtracting fractions, doing all kinds of things with fractions. But remember, fractions aren't as bad as most people think they are. And as we work towards this, we'll see that they're actually not as hard as people think they are. So, first, let's talk about what a multiple is. A multiple of any number is the product of that number and any non-zero positive value. So, the multiples of 2 are 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and it keeps going on forever. The multiples of 3 are 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, because 3 times 2 is 6, 3 times 3 is 9, 3 times 4 is 12, so forth and so on. So the multiple of a number is either equal to or bigger than the initial value. So let's talk about the multiples of 7. So 7 times 1 is 7, there's a multiple. 7 times 2 is 14, there's a multiple. 7 times 3 is 21, there's a multiple. All right, common multiples are when two or more values share some multiples. For instance, we've already talked about the multiples of 7, 14, 21, and it continues going. Let's look at the multiples of 10, 20, 30, 40. Those are pretty easy because they're all just counting numbers with a 0 on the end of it. But what numbers do 10 and 7 both go into? Well, one of them is 70. 7 times 10 is 70, and 10 times 7 is 70. Another one is 140. 7 times 20 is 140. 10 times 14 is 140. So 70 and 140 are both common multiples between the numbers 7 and 10. Now, every pair of numbers has common multiples. Sometimes it's just those two numbers multiplied together. That's going to be the least common multiple. And other times it might be something smaller. And when we're looking for the smallest multiple that is common between 2 or 3 or even more numbers, that's going to be called the least common multiple. And what's the advantage of finding the least common multiple? Well, it's kind of common sense. Smaller numbers are easier to work with. And I'd rather do math in the easiest way possible than a harder way if it's possible. So the least common multiple is going to be the smallest number, and we want the smallest number because smaller numbers are easier to work with. Although there are a number of methods we could use to find the lowest or least common multiple, I think the easiest way, other than just knowing your math facts, which you guys should work on as you work to perfect your math knowledge, the more you know about numbers, the easier these problems become. But I think the easiest process is to list out the factors of the numbers and, All right, guys, here's another example. Let's say we have three numbers, 15, 20, and 24. Now, using the same method I just showed you, I'm going to use 15 and the multiples of 15 to try to find the least common multiple. So here's 15, and I'm going to list out all of the multiples, and for each one, I'm going to look to see which one 20 and 24 both divide evenly into with no remainder. So Here's 15. The multiples of 15 are 15, 30, 45, 60, 75, 90, 105, 120. Stop. 120 seems like it has potential. So, I'm going to look at 120. I'm going to divide it by 20, and that's 6. So that works. 120 divided by 24 is 5. So, of all these multiples of 15, the first one that divides evenly by 20 and 24 is 120. That means 120 is the LCM, or least common multiple. All right, well, what happens if you have letters inside your numbers? What happens if you have a number and a letter as part of the values you're trying to find the least common multiple for? Well, the numbers are done the same way. So when you see numbers in front of letters, find the least common multiple for the numbers first. That's part one. And then the variables are actually really easy. So if you have variables with the same base, so if you have all x's or all y's, or even if you have x's and y's in your term, look at the x's separately. And the least common multiple for all of your x's will be whatever the highest exponent for x is. So if we had x as one value, x squared as another value, and x cubed, or to the third power, as our third value, x to the third power would be the least common multiple because x multiplies into x cubed, x squared multiplies into x cubed, and of course x cubed multiplies into itself. Alright, so here's our example. Check this out. We have 4m to the third power, c to the second power, and then the other number is 15, m to the second power, and then c to the fourth power. Alright, let's separate these. Here's my numbers, 4 and 15. I can find my least common multiple there pretty easily. 4 and 15, I'm going to list the multiples of 4 and see which one goes into 15 as well. It turns out that the least common multiple here is 60. 60 is the least common multiple. It's just the product of 4 and 15. But let's look at the m's. So we have m to the third and we have m to the second. Now m to the third is really just m times m times m. M to the second's m times m. So the top one has 3 m's, the bottom one has 2 m's. The 3 m's together being multiplied is the least common multiple. Because if I take m squared and multiply it by m, I get m to the third. So m to the third is the least common multiple there. And let's look at our c's. I got c squared, which is just c times c. And then I have c to the fourth, which is c times c times c times c. Now c squared times c squared is c to the fourth. So the least common multiple there is c to the fourth. So my least common multiple between 4m to the third c squared and 15m squared c to the fourth is 60m to the third c to the fourth. Let me give you the shortcut. Hey, when you have variables, it's always going to be the variable with the highest exponent. That's going to be the least common multiple. All right, and finally, let's talk about least common denominators. Now, when we talk about denominators, we're talking about fractions. And we talked a little bit about this in the video we did on equivalent fractions. It's hard to see and compare fractions unless they are in the same container. Another way to say that is they have the same denominator. So, when we look at two fractions, let's take these two fractions, for instance. We're going to look at 7/20ths and 9/25ths. Now, they're in different containers. The first one has a container marked in 20 parts, and 7 of them are filled up. The second one is marked in 25 parts, and 9 of them are filled up. So which one's bigger and how much bigger is it? Well, in order to figure this out really, we have to put them into the same container. Now, the least common denominator is simply this. Here's the definition. So if you're going to take notes, here's what you want to take notes on. The least common denominator is simply the least common multiple of the denominators. So let's look at our denominators. We got 20 and we got 25. The least common multiple between 20 and 25 is 100. 20 goes into 100 5 times, and 25 goes into 100 4 times. That's going to be significant because we're going to multiply numerator and denominator by that value. So let's look at 7/20. If I multiply 7/20 by 5 over 5, which remember, any number divided by itself is 1, and anything multiplied by 1 is itself, so I'm not changing the value, I'm just changing the container. So 5 over 5 times 7 over 20 becomes 35 over 100. Hey, let's slide over and look at 9/25. If I multiply 9/25 by 4 over 4, and again remember 4 over 4 is just 1, and 1 times anything is itself, so I'm not changing the value, I'm just changing the container, I'm changing the way it looks. So 9 over 25 times 4 over 4 becomes 36 over 100. So 35 over 100 or 36 over 100. They're really close, but 36 is bigger. And 36 came from 9 over 25. So 9/25 is the bigger fraction. That's how we use common denominators or least common denominators to compare fractions. All right, that completes our video on least common multiple that included least common denominator, and you should be ready to work on any problems you have now in your homework. Good luck.